43 years ago, in the city of Bath, England, 17-year-old Melanie Road was stabbed and killed about 200 meters from her home. The attack was so violent that it stunned a city where crimes like this were almost unheard of. Detectives quickly realized they were dealing with an offender who had left behind an extraordinary amount of forensic evidence. Blood, biological evidence, a trail that appeared to trace the killer's escape from the scene. It looked like exactly the kind of case that should have been solved, but it wasn't. Police launched one of the largest murder investigations Britain had ever seen. Thousands of names were examined. Thousands of samples were collected. Every promising lead was pursued. Yet year after year, the investigation returned to the same unanswered question. Who had killed Melanie Road? The greatest mystery was not the lack of evidence, it was the opposite. From the very first day of the investigation, detectives possessed evidence that belonged to the killer himself. Yet despite having what appeared to be the key to the entire case, they could not put a name to it. Meanwhile, somewhere in Britain, the person responsible continued living an ordinary life, untouched by suspicion. More than 30 years would pass before a single scientific breakthrough transformed one of Britain's most enduring cold cases and revealed how the answer had been waiting in the evidence all along. But before we dive deep into this story, please let us know where you are watching from. And if stories like this interest you, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. In the early 1980s, Bath was widely regarded as one of England's safest cities. Best known for its Roman baths, Georgian architecture, and historic streets, it was a place where violent stranger attacks were exceptionally rare. Residents took pride in the city's reputation, and for many families, it felt like the kind of community where young people could enjoy a night out with friends without constant fear. The Road family had moved to Bath about 2 years before the events of this case. They embraced their new home and quickly became part of the local community. Their youngest daughter, Melanie, was thriving there. She had built a close circle of friends, excelled at school, and was looking ahead to university with every reason to believe her future was just beginning. No one could have imagined that one summer night would change not only the lives of Melanie's family, but also the sense of security felt across the entire city. What followed would become a murder investigation unlike any Bath had experienced before, one that would continue for more than 3 decades, and ultimately demonstrate both the limits of forensic science in 1984 and its extraordinary power many years later. Born on September 29, 1966, Melanie Road was the youngest of 3 children born to Jean and Anthony Road. Her older sister Karen and older brother Adrian were already beginning lives of their own, leaving Melanie as the youngest, the family's little duckling, as Karen affectionately called her. She attended Bath High School for Girls, where she was known as a bright, outgoing student who found it easy to make friends. Her classmates had chosen her as deputy head girl, reflecting the respect she had earned among both students and teachers. Away from the classroom, she enjoyed sports and played on the school's hockey team. Academically, she was excelling in her A-level studies and was preparing for university. Friends and family described her as cheerful, easygoing, and someone who made others feel comfortable simply by being around her. At 17, her life appeared to be opening toward new opportunities. Friday, June 8, 1984, began like any other summer day. The afternoon was spent playing tennis with friends. Later that evening, she met her boyfriend, Michael, along with a group of friends for a night out in Bath's city center. It was the Friday before her A-level examinations, and like many young people at the start of a summer weekend, they visited several pubs before finishing the evening at Beau Bash nightclub. The group remained there until around 2 o'clock in the morning, when the nightclub closed and everyone began making their separate journeys home. Before they parted, Michael offered to pay for a taxi so Melanie could get home safely. She declined. Instead, she chose to walk. It was a route she knew well. From the nightclub to her home on St. Stephen's Close was roughly a 30-minute walk through streets she had used before. The distance was short, the route was familiar, and in a city like Bath, it did not seem like an unusual decision. As she left her friends and began walking home through the early hours of June 9th, none of them realized they were seeing her for the last time. She never arrived home. Just a few hours later, at approximately 5:30 that morning, local milkman Tony and his 11-year-old son Ian were making their regular deliveries along St. Stephen's Court. While delivering milk to nearby homes, Ian noticed the body of a young woman lying near a residential garage. Police officers quickly arrived and sealed off the area. The scene they encountered revealed an exceptionally violent attack. Melanie had been sexually assaulted and stabbed 26 times. As forensic investigators carefully examined the scene, they discovered a set of keys resting on a nearby ledge. Attached to them was a small wooden block engraved with a single name: Melanie. At that moment, investigators still did not know who the victim was. Hoping someone nearby could identify her, officers drove through surrounding streets using a loudspeaker, repeatedly calling out the name engraved on the keys. Only a short distance away, Jean and Anthony Road had just begun to realize something was wrong. When they woke that Saturday morning, Melanie's bed had not been slept in. She was a responsible teenager and normally kept her parents informed about where she was going. Even so, they initially considered a more ordinary explanation. Perhaps she had stayed with a friend after the evening ended. Perhaps she would be home shortly. Then, at around 9:15 that morning, they heard a police vehicle outside. Through its loudspeaker came a single name: Melanie. Jean later recalled that her heart immediately sank. She rushed outside, caught up with the police car, and told the officer that they had a daughter named Melanie who had not returned home. The officer then confirmed what every parent fears hearing. Their 17-year-old daughter had been found dead. In an instant, an ordinary Saturday morning became the beginning of a grief that would last for decades. The loss extended far beyond that single day. Jean later described forgetting to eat and struggling to sleep because of recurring nightmares. She found herself walking through places in Bath where she and Melanie had once spent time together, hoping for reminders of the daughter she had lost. The impact reached every member of the family. Adrian, who had been studying in Scotland, returned home after learning of his sister's death. Karen traveled to Bath with her young family. What had been an ordinary Friday only hours earlier had become a permanent dividing line in their lives. The wider community felt the shock as well. Bath had long been regarded as a safe city, where violent attacks of this nature were rare. Melanie's murder challenged that belief overnight. Residents struggled to understand how such a crime could occur in their neighborhood, knowing that the person responsible had disappeared before daylight and could still be living among them. For detectives, the investigation was only beginning. For Melanie's family, it was the beginning of a search for answers that would outlast more than 3 decades. With the crime scene secured, detectives faced an investigation unlike anything Bath had experienced in recent memory. The brutality of the attack suggested that whoever had killed Melanie had used extreme violence. But alongside the horror was something investigators rarely encounter in a murder case: an abundance of forensic evidence. The challenge would not be finding clues. It would be turning those clues into a name. The post-mortem examination established that Melanie had been sexually assaulted twice before she was killed. She had suffered 26 stab wounds, with 21 to the front of her body and 5 to her back. Investigators noted that many of the wounds were concentrated on the right side of her body, leading them to believe the attacker was most likely left-handed. The scene itself told an equally important story. Near the garage where Melanie's body was found, investigators identified another pool of blood. From its location, they believed she had initially sought shelter beside the wall before being dragged into the nearby cul-de-sac, where the fatal attack continued. But the evidence did not stop there. A trail of blood stretched away from the scene for nearly 800 meters toward St. Stephen's Road. Every visible bloodstain was carefully documented, photographed, mapped, and collected. In total, forensic specialists recorded 74 separate blood spots. Most belonged to Melanie. 14 did not. Those 14 bloodstains belonged to another person. Detectives believed the attacker had injured himself during the assault and unknowingly left behind his own blood as he fled. In addition to the blood evidence, forensic examinations recovered semen left at the scene, confirming investigators were searching for a male offender. Today, DNA evidence is often viewed as the fastest route to identifying a suspect, but in 1984, that technology was still in its infancy. Investigators could preserve biological evidence, but they had few practical ways to compare it against potential offenders. Instead, attention turned to the attacker's blood. Laboratory analysis revealed that the unknown blood carried a rare protein profile found in only about 3% of the population. It was a significant discovery. While it could not identify one individual, it dramatically reduced the number of people investigators needed to eliminate. For detectives, it appeared to be the breakthrough that could solve the case. The investigation rapidly expanded. Police examined not only men living in Bath but also visitors who had been in the city that weekend. Hotels and guest houses were checked. Guest registers were reviewed. Officers worked to identify virtually every man who could have been in the area when Melanie was attacked. The list quickly grew to more than 8,000 names. Over the following months and years, investigators collected more than 2,500 blood and DNA samples. Around 94 men were arrested during different stages of the investigation, and detectives pursued more than 6,000 separate lines of inquiry. Men with histories of sexual offenses were investigated. Men known to carry knives were questioned. Individuals whose alibis could not immediately be verified were interviewed, tested, and, where appropriate, arrested before being eliminated. Few investigations received this level of attention. This was not a case where detectives ignored evidence or failed to pursue obvious leads. They repeatedly followed every credible avenue available to them. And yet, every promising lead ended the same way: no match. The man whose blood had been left at the scene was nowhere among the thousands already investigated. As months became years, public appeals continued, and Melanie's family joined investigators in asking anyone with information to come forward. Nothing changed. Gradually, the stream of new information slowed. The investigation never officially closed, but it entered the long and difficult period familiar to many cold cases. Evidence remained carefully preserved. Investigators periodically reviewed the file, but the identity of Melanie's killer remained unknown. Then, more than a decade after the murder, science offered investigators another opportunity. In 1995, the United Kingdom established its first national DNA database. For detectives working the Road investigation, it represented a major advance. The biological evidence collected back in 1984 was used to create a DNA profile of the unknown attacker, which was entered into the growing national database. For the first time, investigators had the ability to compare the killer's DNA against offenders whose profiles had been legally collected across the country. There was reason for optimism, but when the comparison was completed, there was no match. The results suggested that whoever had murdered Melanie had not entered the database through another qualifying offense since 1984. It was another setback. Still, investigators understood that the database was constantly expanding. Every year, more profiles were added. The possibility remained that one day the person responsible, or someone connected to him, might eventually appear. So the evidence stayed, the case remained open, and the waiting continued. The years brought occasional moments of renewed hope. On the 25th anniversary of Melanie's murder, a televised appeal generated dozens of new leads. One proved especially intriguing when a nurse reported that a patient had confessed to Melanie's murder while on his deathbed. Investigators acted quickly. DNA testing on preserved body tissue initially produced a partial match, briefly raising hopes that the decades-long mystery had finally been solved. Further testing, however, eliminated him as a suspect. Once again, investigators found themselves exactly where they had started. The evidence had spoken, but not clearly enough. By now, nearly 3 decades had passed. The investigation had outlived police careers. Advances in forensic science had repeatedly breathed new life into the case, only for each new possibility to fade away. By 2014, 30 years after Melanie Road was murdered, investigators made one more decision: to revisit the case from the beginning. This time, they would rely on a forensic technique that had not existed when the investigation first began, and for the first time in 3 decades, the evidence was finally ready to answer the question it had been holding since June 1984. A comprehensive cold case review was launched under the leadership of Detective Superintendent Julie Mackay. Rather than beginning with new suspects, investigators returned to the physical evidence that had been waiting for 3 decades. This time, they turned to familial DNA searching. Unlike a direct DNA match, familial searching looks for close biological relatives whose DNA may already exist within the national database. Even if the offender has never submitted a DNA sample, a relative's profile can point investigators toward the correct family. The first search produced no meaningful breakthrough. It was another disappointment, but investigators understood that the database was constantly growing. New DNA profiles were being added every year, and with each addition came another opportunity to search again. So they waited. When another familial search was eventually conducted, the result was very different. The match belonged to a woman named Claire Hampton. She had entered the National DNA Database in 2014 following a minor domestic incident. Detectives were not investigating her. Instead, they began examining her family tree to determine whether a close male relative could have been in Bath in June 1984. Their attention soon focused on her father, Christopher Hampton. Investigators discovered that he had lived in Bath at the time Melanie was murdered. More than 30 years later, he was living in Bristol and working as a painter and decorator. Police contacted him and requested a DNA sample. He agreed. According to the officers involved, Christopher Hampton appeared calm and willingly provided the swab. The sample was sent for forensic analysis. When the results came back, they answered the question detectives had been asking since 1984. Christopher Hampton's DNA was an exact match to the biological evidence recovered from the scene of Melanie Road's murder. After more than 3 decades, investigators finally knew the identity of the man they had been searching for. For Melanie's family, the wait for answers had lasted more than 30 years. At last, the investigation could move toward justice. On July 3, 2015, Christopher Hampton was arrested. The following day, the 64-year-old was charged with the rape and murder of Melanie Road. For more than 3 decades, he had remained completely outside the investigation. Despite the scale of Operation Rhodium, despite thousands of interviews and more than 2,500 DNA and blood samples, he had never been among the men arrested or seriously suspected. While detectives searched for Melanie's killer, Hampton had continued living an ordinary life. He married twice. He became the father of 4 children. By all accounts, those around him had no idea he was connected to one of Britain's longest-running murder investigations. When officers arrived to arrest him, his wife reportedly believed there had been some mistake. According to one officer's account, she asked whether she would see him later that evening. Hampton's response was simple: "No, you won't." Although he cooperated by providing his DNA, he refused to explain what had happened in June 1984. During police interviews, he remained silent. He never described the attack. He never explained why Melanie had been targeted, and he never offered her family the answers they had spent decades hoping to hear. His trial was scheduled to begin at Bristol Crown Court in March 2016. Initially, Hampton pleaded not guilty. Then, shortly before the trial, he unexpectedly changed his plea to guilty. The reason for that decision has never been publicly explained. Because of the guilty plea, the proceedings lasted only about an hour and 20 minutes. On May 9, 2016, Christopher Hampton was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years. For Melanie's family, the sentencing brought justice, but not closure. Karen Road told the court that losing her sister had been devastating, but that waiting more than 3 decades without anyone being held responsible had made that suffering even harder to bear. Her brother, Adrian, spoke about living with uncertainty for 32 years. Every unfamiliar face, every stranger, every man sitting nearby had prompted the same question: could this be the person who killed my sister? Now at last, he knew the answer. Jean Road, Melanie's mother, described the profound impact the murder had on every part of their family's lives. She recalled forgetting to eat, enduring constant nightmares, wandering through Bath searching for reminders of her daughter, and praying that the rain would not wash away the bloodstains where Melanie had died. She spoke of the emotional strain that gradually affected every member of the family over the decades that followed. Nothing said in court could restore the future Melanie had lost. Nothing could return the years her family had spent waiting. But after 32 years, the person responsible had finally been held accountable. Even then, one important question remained unanswered. Christopher Hampton has never explained why he committed the crime. Melanie Road herself is no longer remembered simply as the victim of an unsolved murder. She is remembered as a bright young woman whose life was cut short, whose family never gave up, and whose case became a powerful example of how perseverance and scientific progress can finally bring justice, even after 32 years.